The history of the bowed electric string, or the evolution of the violin family. First up, I'm an electric violinist who also loves to explore and write. I was once told I could not major in electric violin because it was too new. There was no one who could examine me. I was, therefore, delving in an entirely new and unexplored field where the nuggets of truth had to be laboriously pried out with the crowbar and pickaxe of careful observation. An electric violinist since 1985, I've found the story of electric violin best told chronologically, with side and back steps necessarily made along the way. Many have been tempted into this ocean, where few, very few, escape shipwreck. When we reflect that knowledge without a system consists of nothing but detached scraps with which the memory is overburdened and the mind very little enlightened. To understand and fully appreciate the electric violin, or to make the best informed choice purchasing a new or first electric instrument, it is not enough to know only about the most recent developments in the past few years, even decades. Better to approach it from the broadest scope, from a perspective spanning the whole of the 20th century. After such wide and extensive research, it is clear that the majority of developments found in the latter part of the century were based largely on near zero knowledge of the groundwork and foundations laid before them. To the seeker after the new, or the sensational, to those who expect a sinister frisson from modern music, it is my melancholy duty to point out that all the bomb-throwing and guillotining has already taken place. Certainly, after the 1950s, those picking up the quest for an ideal electrified violin are pursuing a path maybe less trodden, but nonetheless already cleared. The fetters have been snapped from the art of music. These instruments mark an absolutely new epoch in music as well as in musical instruments. The contemporary researcher, compared to one just a few years ago, has a vastly enriched database of material to search and draw from to focus their study on the people, events, places and times that matter. As can readily be found, there are instances of players, makers of instruments and composers working with electric violin, stating that they were the first to do so. Assumedly, mostly made in honesty, the claimant, having searched around available sources, found nothing of note to contradict, and simply a wrong conclusion was drawn. Such are the resources available today, however. Any sales pitch purporting to be the first in this field must be treated as one coming from a shallow view of the subject, and thus treated with caution, or simply humoured. A case for an electronically adjusted electric violin was made long ago. The evidence gathered and reviewed here is largely drawn from digital databases of published material spanning an impossible number of pages to sift through by hand, even given many lifetimes. It is now so fluid to search that the possibilities are overwhelming in quite a different way. There is still so much to explore. The electric violin appeared over a period of many decades. Individuals perfected devices that, on reflection, can be understood to have been combined in instruments that we now find firmly established in the profession. Although there is still some debate of what constitutes proper definition of the term electric violin, the use here aims to take in the whole of the violin family of instruments and encompasses all methods to electrify the sound of a violin. This more general approach allows for greater scope and gives better perspective. The existence of electric violin is inextricably linked to a simple necessity to be heard. There are many curios, vagaries, obscurities and novelties found scattered throughout the history of musical instrument progression, and the violin family shares a wealth of quackery which is wholly ignorable. Fads, fancy fashions and crazes come and go, but electric violin is none of them. It is safe to say it is here to stay and has already been here for many decades. I take the view that the electric violin was fully formed and perfectly defined in 1957 by Clarence Leo Fender as an instrument consisting of a specially designed body and electric pickup. There were electric violins before, but it is in the wake of the fender violin that all the elements are finally found combined in one place. The profession really takes off in the following decades, finding lasting footholds by the end of the millennium. Bowed electric strings was a new subject to most people about 30 years ago. It was a very new subject for some 60 years ago, and to all but a few, it was completely unheard of 100 years ago. From any vantage throughout the whole of the last century, electric violin was definitely a subject. Studying this evolutionary history and discovering the story of the electric violin, it is shown that on the whole, violinists have been very slow, even reluctant or worse, maybe refused to embrace this wonderful, versatile and augmented violin. Things have changed now, and the way forward is clear. To discover how and why bowed electric strings evolved to be a subject means going back to the early 1800s, when touring musicians such as the great Italian virtuoso Niccolò Paganini travelled from venue to venue by horse-drawn carriage, over crude roads, along country lanes, and through stretches of an uninhabited and unpredictable environment. Their lives were unrecorded by the methods we take for granted today. There is no video, audio, or even photograph capturing Paganini wowing audiences. None of these things had been invented. When Paganini was born, electricity had only just been found to be part of existence and was a phenomenally mysterious medium scientists were grappling to understand. Knowledge of Paganini and reactions to the concerts he gave existed only in newsprint, in letters, and on the lips of people who spoke about him. Tantalizingly, Paganini did refer to the necessary electricity to play. Perhaps electricity had at least inspired a musical mind. Following the pioneering scientific work of Benjamin Franklin and Luigi Galvani in the 18th century, significant opportunities opened up in the study of electricity, particularly after Alessandro Volta presented the electric battery in 1799. Such was the impact of this invention, the International Unit of Electric Potential, the volt, is named in honour. Electricity in the first decades of the 19th century was an exciting subject. The 1820s saw significant successes and further standards set as Hans Christian Ørsted and André Marie Ampère formulated and proved relationships between electricity and magnets. William Sturgeon created the first working electromagnet in 1824, and in 1827 Georg Ohm presented a complete theory of electricity. There was great fascination in electrical phenomena, and minds turned to how this invisible force might be put to novel uses. By 1830, American scientist Joseph Henry had developed powerful electromagnets capable of instantly lifting several anvils, and having been drawn to the same electrical puzzle as Henry, in 1831 Michael Faraday demonstrated simply with a child's bar magnet and a coiled wire that electric current can be created. Whilst Faraday's discoveries are at the heart of modern technology, because of a lack of formal education, the inventor was first considered just a clever tinkerer. Faraday, however, lived long enough to see that everything imagined about invisible force fields really was true. The door was open to things greater and beyond previous perception. Electricity had been unshackled from the constraints of the battery, and Faraday became the hero of the electric age. From these successful discoveries came the first electric motor, the discovery of electromagnetic induction, transformers, and then the first dynamos. Progress was rapid, and although there were no electric violins, the essentials needed for a bowed electric musical instrument had taken root. It would still be many decades before other key scientific discoveries would be made, leading to the perfection of the electric violin. In addition to the wonders of electromagnetism, harnessing the marvels of the piezoelectric effect, currently the most widely used method of creating an electric violin was still a long way off. The foundations for the development of electric stringed instruments were discoveries that a vibrating string can be used to generate electricity, and that the electricity generated is a dynamic fingerprint of the vibrations made by the player. Just as a violin string vibrating on its own is too feeble to be heard without the filtering and amplifying effect given by a specially designed body, the electrical signal produced by an electric violin string needs further transformation before it becomes useful to make music. And whilst well established, be it simple on-off commands or complex tones of speech and music, electricity is an effective means of transmitting messages. It would take many attempts, spanning generations, before the violin would become the successful electric instrument known today. Whether just for fun, out of frustration, pure serendipity, or any other reason, inventions come about after a realization that things don't have to be the way they are. Their necessity drives a leap of imagination or provides that happy accident which leads to a bright idea becoming reality. These inventions and the scientific principles they are based on are well worth the would-be electric violinist's attention. The electric telegraph was a key invention, setting wheels in motion that would ultimately lead to the rise of electric violin. Telegraphy evolved throughout the 19th century and completely changed the way humans communicate, born out of an idea that using electricity might enable messages to be sent immediately across great distances. This was quickly proven and independently established in the early 1830s. By Charles Wheatstone in London, for example, and Samuel Morse in Washington. Ideas surrounding electricity flowed as quickly as the medium in these new wires of telegraphic communication, and very soon a most audacious plan was hatched to connect continents separated by oceans. After years of strenuous efforts and huge costs, the success of the first transatlantic wire ignited imaginations further, sparked more ambitious ideas, carving the way for devices carrying and broadcasting sound and pictures around the globe today. Throughout these times of incredible human endeavour and triumph, the violin, in the 19th century, continued to develop along purely acoustic lines. As concert halls, orchestras and audiences grew, players and composers pushed the boundaries of what could feasibly be drawn from the instrument. Luthiers responded, making adjustments to the best instruments, aiming to make them even better. For tens of thousands of years, music had been confined to a live performance in a given space. The experienced effect of a concert living on only in people's memories, brighter or duller depending on the impact that music made on the individual or group. A desire to capture music so a similar experience could be repeated, perhaps compelled written notation systems to be developed. But the musical instructions still required musicians to turn them into musical sound, and crucially needed to be done within a suitable space for an audience to experience them. The first effective devices created by the 1880s that could record, store and play back the sound of music blew open an entirely new future, presenting new challenges, tools and opportunities for the musician. The impact was total, and the king of the orchestra was hit hard. The immovable problem was that the violin did not fare well in the recording studio. It was found to be too feeble. Up to that point, even the finest of the great violins had been successfully customized to meet increased demands for volume and nuance. But now, all tried and tested methods failed. The purely acoustic instrument had reached breaking point, and the finest luthiers were unable to fix it. Recording engineers were left scratching their heads, and new record producers possibly even contemplated not bothering with the violin for the next release. But the violin was too popular an instrument. It could not simply be abandoned. Notwithstanding that the violin always evolves from coarsest of musical instruments, creating sound from the friction between a type of bow against an amplified string of sorts, violin had achieved the most exalted position, considered in some circles as perfect, without possibility of being improved. In hindsight, change was inevitable, but likely completely unexpected. The cause of the deficiency was embedded in the instrument's traditional design to disseminate sound evenly. What was needed was a means of directing the sound towards the recording microphone to be captured better than just a pathetic and ghostly murmur. A possible solution emerged in the form of a phonographic violin from the workbench of John Matthias Augustus Stroh, a royal engineer of high esteem. Commonly known as a stroh violin, or by its later brand name, stroh, it was a total reorganisation of the instrument. Essential, but not quite the final transformation before bowed electric strings became a subject. To a mind untrained in music, oblivious to violin history and the great tradition of design, integral dimensions and fine tolerances, Stroh's solution was elementary. Get rid of the violin body and replace it with a trumpet horn. It might appear an overly sweeping simplification, but Stroh's solution worked. They were widely used at the start of the 20th century. The most famous violinists recorded on them. The significant impact communications and the ability to record and playback sound had on the very design and construction of the violin was presumably unimaginable, likely utterly abhorrent to classical violinists of the day. It was such an obviously original and effective musical instrument that Stroh took out a patent, which was promptly granted in early 1900, followed by a slew of similarly horned violins by different brands. In developing the phonographic violin, Stroh was not inhibited or limited by any ingrained notion of what a violin should be, other than it be able to be played by violinists, with a bow on 4 strings stretched across a bridge and nut. Stroh had produced an instrument with a solid, tubular wooden body, upon which he attached all the other customary parts, including a scroll with tuning pegs, a fingerboard mounted on a neck with customary heel or saddle, and a shoulder belt, held by the player's head leaning on a chin rest. In every respect, it was also extraordinary. Under the bridge was a metal cantilevered device engaging with a metal-framed diaphragm by a long armature, leading to a large conical-shaped trumpet horn on the player's shoulder side. The horn, running parallel to the instrument, pointing away from the body, shot the sound out directionally and loudly. In playing a Stroh violin, the rocking motion of the bridge affects the armature, vibrating the membrane on the diaphragm, and through natural amplification from the horn, musical sound reaches the ear of the listener through the air, acoustically. The mechanics found in Stroh's violin follow exactly the same processes, from a phonographic needle in the groove of a spinning record reproducing pre-recorded music. The violinist effectively creates the grooves as the instrument is played. Until recently, Stroh's work creating a phonographic violin was generally understood to be the direct and immediate result of addressing the inadequacy of the bowed string in the recording studio. A brighter spotlight has now been turned on Stroh, and this period of violin history reveals a more complex thought process and evidence that stroviols came from a more protracted quest for a new musical instrument. 2 decades before they were used in studios, announcements exist of several new instruments of great novelty and marvellous ingenuity, including a new musical instrument set to be presented to the Royal Society by Stroh and William Preece. This new musical instrument may well have been the first direct precursor to the phonographic violin, or something different, feasibly electric. The form it took, however, remains to be discovered, as it never made it to the presentation. Having found effective use in the recording studio, within a few years following Stroh's violin invention, the industry went electric. Such were the improvements in fidelity and the overall nature of the devices used in recording, any need for such a drastically altered violin instrument rapidly became obsolete. Whilst freed from an imposed existence as a mere studio instrument, Stroh's violin was also no longer regulation equipment for the professional studio recording violinist, and departed, enjoying continued success elsewhere since. The split was likely amicable and mutual. What Augustus Stroh had inadvertently done was to show that a viable alternative to the design and mechanism of a musical instrument so illustrious as the violin was possible. He did not, as far as is known, invent an electric violin. Departing from the usual line of thinking that electric violins followed directly after horn violins, in the same decade the new phonographic industry emerged. Another wire-based electrical industry was forming, uniting the two paths of violin and electricity. As a logical progression, telephony superseded telegraphy, and it is here that we find critical inventions being applied to bowed strings, converting their musical vibrations into electricity and transforming these signals into audible sound. Alexander Graham Bell's success with the telephone came as a direct result of his attempts to improve the telegraph. Being able to talk with electricity was far superior to the mere dots, dashes, alarms, and other signals basic telegraphy was capable of. It was an understanding of the harmonics of music and investigations of responsive materials that proved the breakthrough, allowing for varying strengths of electrical signals to be transmitted telephonically. In improving the telegraph to the telephone, any communication across great distances using sound became possible, and also a means of creating music to meet the demands and needs of future generations was met. Although there were others working towards exactly the same goal, Bell applied for what is now infamously the first patent for a telephone invention in 1876. American electrical engineer Elisha Gray was also pivotal at this time, making significant discoveries, improvements, and refining technologies that would underpin future electric musical landmarks. The Italian-American inventor Antonio Meucci has also now been formally recognized by the United States Congress House of Representatives for his work in the invention of the telephone, but not until 2002. Over 100 years after his death. Working telephone lines astonish people, despite being far from perfected. At first, each telephone had to be directly connected by a wire to another, and there were no separate headphones or mouthpieces. Users would alternate speaking into the device, then hold it to their ear to listen back to the reply. Mindful that by today's standards the original invention seems crude, the huge potential of the telephone far outweighed any negativity. There was no going back. The first live performances of music streaming through extended wires used electromagnetic devices and were marvels. Telephones were of great interest to musicians and the general public. Their arrival also stirred forebodings that bringing music into every home will empty the concert halls. The rank and file of humanity have been opposed to innovations in all ages, but no progress could have been made without innovations. There always has to be a first time. With the proliferation of telephone technology, these first electric pickup transmitters were put to wide use, and the final step towards an electric violin was now possible. Pronounced as the only known method of adequately distributing sound so as to cover a large space or spaces simultaneously, transmitters were a means to an end. In terms of impact, their inventors had unwittingly electrified the violin. The earliest technology, easily recognizable today as a pickup for attaching to a violin, can be found in creations of electrical engineer John Comer. Claimed to be an improved invention for transmitting music, designed specifically to be attached directly to the body of the musical instrument and expressly before the vibrations had left the instrument as sound. Comer applied for a patent for this inertia type of transmitter in the United States in 1912, and the following year via a patent agent, Walter Howley Derriman, in Great Britain. Derriman's name heads the UK patent, and as such has him confused as an inventor in some sources. Comer's invention was granted patent in 1914, by which point he had also been awarded several others relating to relaying live music electrically to a distant point via telephone lines. The list of microphone or pickup type inventions also includes amplification and loudspeakers, showing steady work in this area from the early 1900s. A description of the musical instruments used in the studio, alongside a grainy black and white photograph, reveals that originally the pickup was placed on the belly, close to the bridge. In the specifications given, Comer notes that moving the device to the edge of the instrument and padding the point of contact with felt to limit vibration yields a far superior result. Having experimented with the placement of his transmitter pickup device, in antithesis to the experience in the acoustic recording studio, it was discovered the vibrations from the violin were actually so strong they easily overpowered the device, causing arcing, a very harsh effect. Another departure from generally accepted knowledge and seemingly overlooked to date is that Comer's violin transmitter invention was a device utilising the piezoelectric effect. The groundwork leading up to that point, including an earlier invention by Comer for sound transmitting instruments, had been focused around electromagnetic devices. This newly discovered piezo science very soon played a significant part in the development of the electric violin. Whilst the phenomena of piezoelectricity, or the pyroelectric effect, is noted to have been discovered in the 18th century, there were no practical applications until Pierre and Jacques Curie demonstrated a relationship between mechanical stress and electric charge in 1880. Even then, it remained a scientific curiosity until 1910, when Voldemar Voigt's textbook on crystal physics was published detailing the properties of many crystalline substances. The key point in relation to evolution of the violin is that particular natural substances give off electrons when they vibrate. And as with wires and magnets, the electric current produced from certain crystals, such as Rochelle and quartz, is analogous to the unique fluctuation of vibration. The significance immediate to anyone considering the market of bowed electric strings today, as the vast majority of products available use the piezo method. Comer's inventions are connected to the Automatic Enunciator Company based in Chicago and reveal years of experimentation leading to an exciting enterprise called Muzola Phone, offering the Malta Muzola subscription service to distribute live and pre-recorded music by telephone wires. In the light of current huge popularity surrounding digital musical services around the world, the business was remarkably ahead of its time. It should be noted, though, that Comer's work was not to create a new musical instrument. His focus was to find the best way to allow live music to be heard over distances of several hundred miles. Whilst Comer and the Automatic Enunciator Company were setting out their broadcast systems, in London, another development combining telephonic transmitters and violins was unfolding. The well-established musical instrument inventor and manufacturer Arthur Thomas Hausen applied for a patent in 1913 for improvements in or connected with phonofiddles, violins and other stringed musical instruments, just one day after Comer's electric transmitter was applied for in the UK. Hausen's patent was accepted the following year, 2 months sooner than Comer received his. As with Comer's transmitter, Hausen's invention allows sound from a stringed instrument to be electrically transmitted to a horn or sounding device removed or detached from the instrument. Hausen similarly describes a device applied to the instrument itself, transferring string vibration directly into electrical energy using the piezoelectric effect from granulated carbon. In his provisional specification, Hausen proposes that for some instruments, the transmitter may be placed inside or outside the body beneath the bridge. The key difference between Hausen and Comer inventions is the physical design of the musical instrument they are fitted. Comer's device is clearly intended to be attached to a traditional instrument, whilst Hausen claimed improvements redesigning the body. Between them, they defined two of the most widely adopted methods of electrifying bowed strings. Comer's work is at the root of today's market for pickups attached to instruments, Hausen's for integrated electric technology. The success of electric transmitter devices would inspire future minds to envisage an entirely new instrument and ultimately unleash the full potential of the bowed electric string. They also likely saved the acoustic violinist being stuck with Stroh's horned beast. A whole new and separate branch of instrument development takes off from Stroh's horn device, as found in the work of violinist and violin maker John Doppiera, inventor of new diaphragm-driven razophonic instruments, and his work as business partner with George Beecham. The look of these instruments conjures up an optimistic vision of the future through the minds of the 1920s and 30s, and whilst integral to the history of the bowed electric string, it's not these resonator instruments that immediately followed Stroh, Comer or Hausen. The successful manufactured lines of electric instruments found in catalogues under such seismic brand names as National, Rickenbacker, Vega and others would soon appear, but comparatively much later. Electrical microphone technology was very quickly adopted on phonographs, and acoustically driven horn technology dropped in favour of coils, magnets and crystals. Following World War I, electricity became the prime mover, and the musical landscape began to change. Dancehall and jazz became fast-growing popular sounds. The struggles the traditional violin family had faced in the recording studio were now encountered on stage. These comparatively weak instruments were quickly submerged by horn and rhythm sections and the noise of socialising and dancing in large resonant halls. Some players experimented with heavier bows, doubled with black hair and instruments with wire-wound strings, but the results were still not powerful enough to compete. In a small town in the county of Sullivan, New Hampshire, noted violinist and teacher Fred C. Hammond invented an electric violin amplifier which promised to increase and smooth its tone, so that fewer players could do the same work as many. In 1922, Hammond applied for a patent described as a tone-amplifying apparatus for musical instruments and described a violin or similar instrument fitted with a specially adapted soundpost. Here, Hammond incorporated a round button microphone, presumably the popular granulated carbon type, and transferred the vibration of the violin strings and body directly to an amplifying circuit using batteries, coils and tubes. The system allowed the orchestra director to readily change the volume of music to suit and to modify the tone of each instrument independently of the player. Very little further information about Hammond's soundpost pickup is known, beyond a letter Hammond wrote to the editor of the Violinist magazine about his device and some of the experiments in developing it. A significant factor making his idea practical was a massive decrease in the price of amplifying vacuum tubes, essential components in radio technology and operation of amplifiers at the time. Hammond recounts that with the advent of the radio, tubes dropped in price from $250 to less than $7. He ends his letter with a prediction that the electrification of the violin is destined to become useful and is certainly worth investigation. A satisfactory definition of an electric violin can casually be agreed to be determined largely by design of the body and method of electrification. An electric violin might have a most minimal skeletal body, specially designed to use a pickup as an integral part of the instrument. It might also look exactly like an acoustic violin, electrified by hidden means. In terms of a history of the bowed electric string within the context of an evolution of violin, it is impossible to pin a breakthrough moment on any one person. As is known, the components facilitating electric violins come from various sources, and each are the result of many experiments and chance discoveries made by a great many people. The best contemporary electric violin family members contain the entire DNA of violin, from inception through every nuance of successful change to the most up-to-date instrument today. References to electric violins appear in newspapers and advertising from the late 1860s. Comment can be found that Johann Strauss created an inimitable stir, directing an orchestra at the will of the magic electric violin. There is a report noting that some go to the circus just to hear the steam electric violin, and that concerts were given by Herr Karl Plume, the great electric violin virtuoso. Announcement heralds fiddling by electricity, and that the latest electric wonder is an electric violin, and the electric violin can give orchestral effects. With the mind-boggling exception of a steam-powered electric violin, the use of the word electric in the 19th century is as an adjective, the authors tapping into the wonder and excitement that the then new science stirred. There is, however, a blurry crossover point around the cusp of the 20th century. Statements are found of a new musical instrument called an electric violin. Exploring these cases, it is found to be an automatic novelty music machine, a hybrid of the type of musical instrument known as a player piano, manufactured incorporating complex mechanics to robotically draw tones from an acoustic violin. Although marketed as an electric violin, it was a highly elaborate music box and nothing to do with the evolution of the bowed electric string. A patent for an electric self-playing violin was granted in 1905 to Henry Sandell, assigned to the Mills Novelty Company based in Chicago. At least one reporter described the instrument in disgust as a violin that would scrape itself, labelling the inventor as a desecrator. One feasible earliest reference to a violinist playing an electric violin in 1908 deserves closer inspection. Considering the technology available at the time, and predating consensus of when the first electric violins appeared by some years, public announcements were made in many newspapers for concerts given by Miss Laura Peterson, playing the only electric violin in existence of her own invention. In their brevity, the articles note Peterson as a Swedish-born virtuoso living in America, and that her vaudeville performances were set with the most magnificent splendour. They were remarkable and were a hit. Are these references to a violin emitting tones via electrical means, or is the instrument in question an automatic electric violin player machine wrongly attributed to Peterson? Whilst of interest, rather than journalism based on noting the dainty and clever violinist, more useful details need to be found. All this stumbling around in the mists of time, grasping at straws, chasing wild geese and falling down rabbit holes looking for a needle in a haystack is necessary. It becomes increasingly fruitless to attempt an accurate chronology. The risk of becoming completely lost or losing the thread is real, but such is the nature of researching history, particularly one barely studied before. What is given as a definitive date in one source is not always a true reflection of activities at the time. Whilst patent books, journals, periodicals and other regularly published media might suggest a lineage, people were experimenting and developing their instruments simultaneously, some with knowledge of others, either competitively or collaboratively, even crookedly, whilst others remain entirely unaware. There are a myriad of individuals involved, and unfortunately some slipped into obscurity. The further one probes into ancient history, the more one loses oneself and strays along uncertain paths. To have any hope of making sense of what can be found, a line is necessarily drawn, and attention turns to the instruments known to have been created as new electric violins. From the 1920s, alongside the rapid proliferation of radio technologies, there is clear and increasingly detailed evidence of makers and players utilising electricity to create novel sounds with the bowed string. Inventions and creations in this field from the first half of the 20th century are noted for the new experiences they gave and were considered to be the first mark of a great future to come. For the sake of coherence, only those instruments that are found to have a more significant presence are included, and despite the overlaps, I've tried to follow historical events sequentially. Time is lucrative in favour of the truth. Frederick W. Deardorff is associated with some of the earliest documented notices of an electric violin fitting the form of the instrument we know today. A sketch drawing made in October 1922 of an electric instrument connected to an amplifier and loudspeaker may just be the earliest depiction of an electric violin idea with no soundbox. From Deardorff's subsequent application for a patent in 1924, awarded in 1929, more details about the inventor and the invention can be pieced together. With identically named Frederick W. Deardorffs born in 1889 and other Fred Deardorffs living at this time, each leading their different lives in the Rochester, New York and surrounding areas, it's initially quite difficult to connect the right person to the story of electric violin. The Deardorff pertinent to this study can be traced with the help of a celebration of his work found in a magazine issued by the Kodak Association. There is a photo and enough references in the short article to events corroborated by several newspaper reports and supported by obituaries to be confident of the right Fred Deardorff. Most usefully, the Kodak article references work with electric violin and gives reason why it vanished as instantly the idea was conceived. The published patent drawings and specifications by Deardorff reveal a violin with head, neck and body frame or rib fitted with strings, bridge, tailpiece and chin rest. Notably for the player, the only reference to where the body would be is from the traditional shaped neck saddle. Instead of the usual resonating body, a mounting central ring is fitted to the frame, within which a tapered drum rests on non-vibrant padding of felt and rubber. The upper side of the drum is fitted with a main diaphragm positioned directly under the feet of the bridge. Secured to the underside of the main diaphragm is a secondary diaphragm fitted with a carbon piezo pickup. The patent states the vibrations of the strings are transmitted through the bridge, then electrically transmitted through the pickup and amplifier to a loudspeaker with current supplied by a battery. One feature of Deardorff's electric violin is that the vibrations received by the pickup unit are isolated from any vibrations created in the structure of the instrument. The pickup unit is not secured or fitted to the frame and is removable. As an inventor in the 1920s of instruments without a sound chamber, even with an electric device integrated into the structure to transmit string vibration, Deardorff is not the first. This apparatus for reproducing musical tones came nearly a decade after Howson's electrified hornless phonograph violin. Of significance, though, in this new instrument, defined preferably in the nature of a violin, and envisaged as a complete violin family, was also the means to modify the vibrations. Here the inventor claimed creation of a violin that could not only transcend the confines of any space it was to be played in, but also be a violin that could morph in timbre too. What prompted this transcendence does not appear to have been noted, but is possibly connected to Deardorff understanding the technique of violin as a professional player, maybe even from having an interest in helping the deaf, or very simply, that Deardorff recognised the potential in Fred C. Hammond's electric soundpost pickup and later bought the rights. According to digitised data available, Deardorff studied violin as a child with Miss Fidelia Lester and had taken part in pupil recitals by 1902. Continuing with violin and later also taking up alto horn and trumpet, Deardorff worked himself into leading a travelling circus orchestra and played with the Cotton Blossom Floating Theatre, one of the original Mississippi River showboats. After briefly joining the Al G. Field Minstrels, he returned to Rochester and around 1913 began working for the Kodak Company. Here he led the plant band and was a key figure providing regular performing arts experiences for the workplace community. At the outset of World War I, Deardorff enlisted and was assigned to an infantry band and soon went to play in England and France. As director and leader, Deardorff's newly formed Alliance Band gave their first concert and dance at St George's Hall in Rochester. Advertising at the time noted several new novelties not to be disclosed until the big night. Such novelties may have been the use of microphones and loudspeaker systems, but too early for the electric violin in question. After the war, he returned to the Kodak Company, continuing his work providing music and musical activities for the benefits of the people working there. From the mid-1920s, Deardorff began demonstrating his electric violin invention in concerts. Media at the time referred to the instrument as the raiolin, a device utilizing violin, radio and telephonic principles, describing it as some kind of combination of microphone, receiver and sender. One report predicted a fortune awaiting Deardorff for inventing it, and noted that the audience were kept in a happy mood, as well as in surprise, and all voted it a magnificent success. In the year before Deardorff received his patent, we learn the raiolin was a feature of concerts given by Victor label recording star Johnny Johnson and his Statler Pennsylvanians at the Hotel Pennsylvania. News headlines were that Deardorff had unearthed possibilities which he had not dreamed, that his raiolin could produce overtones usually inaudible in stringed instruments and could imitate almost any instrument. Interestingly, the instrument was then promoted being played not by Deardorff but by the dance band orchestra leader, Johnson. Doubtful, as Johnson was a pianist and organist, not noted for playing the violin. Perhaps the instrument was played by band member Roy Strom, possibly even heard on a few Victor shellacs. The same article makes the extraordinary claim that the deaf could hear the music all right, but they could hear more than the person with ears. Despite the wonderful reception and stir Deardorff caused, news reports suddenly dried up, and no mention of any other development has been found after the patent was granted. 20 years later, when Deardorff retired from Kodak, the small feature made in the company newspaper revealed Deardorff had decided to shelve his instrument as other inventions of a similar nature appeared and long litigations threatened. Sadly, detail is now emerging that the raiolin drowned in battles for ownerships of rights and revenue from such a type of invention. Purportedly, after Deardorff had failed to secure license fees from other makers pursuing electrifying the violin, legal letters and court proceedings show that Deardorff filed an infringement and copyright lawsuit against the Gibson Company, but lost. The focus of attention shifted elsewhere, and in 1970, Frederick Deardorff died, seemingly having never returned to his electric violin. At the time of writing, the whereabouts of the instrument, even a photograph, is unknown. In view of the importance of the problem of electric music for our age and for the future, musicians will soon be forced to turn their attention to such inventions and ideas as these. From the second half of the 1920s, the first substantial steps had been taken. Instruments were being modified and made anew so that they would be able to broadcast directly over the ether. Makers' names were soon cited as being the first in their field, and their instruments were written about, photographed, recorded, and captured on film. There are numerous articles and adverts appearing across a broad range of publications. Most extol the virtues and benefits of a new electric violin. Of utmost importance to the electric violinist, the whereabouts of a few of their instruments is known, and they can be heard with the benefit of contemporary high-fidelity equipment. The surface of what remains to be done has as yet not been scratched. Often acknowledged and long associated with the creation of the giant tone radio violin, Roman Frederick Startzel was rather more a writer of science fiction than an inventor. However, from a detailed article published early in his writing career, it is clear Startzel experimented with attaching a cheap carbon button pickup sourced from an old telephone transmitter to an acoustic violin. The impetus to experiment came from a dance orchestra leader who asked if the violin could be amplified electrically. Startzel soon discovered the fiendish howl and bedlam of feedback in trying a standalone microphone on stage, so decided to mount the microphone directly on the violin, and thus created an instrument both acoustic and electric. As described, the use of such a device attached and positioned away from the bridge to avoid causing distortion, the giant tone violin follows Comer's telephonic violin exactly, and is very similar to the extensively used method of electrifying a violin in the profession today. Startzel's integration of radio technology to transmit a signal to a distant point places the radio violin as a root ancestor to wireless technologies now widely adopted. The well-cited article, "Radio Gives a Small Violin Foghorn Volume," gives all the details necessary to create the same pickup and amplifier. According to Startzel, the performance of this violin amplifier is phenomenal, but there is no mention of any use other than enabling the violin to dominate all other instruments and be heard all over a large dance hall. In these terms, Startzel's position in the history of bowed electric strings is for a pickup, means of amplification, and method of wireless broadcast. Around this time, too, we find an inventor of bowed electric strings who was also an old-school violin maker. Whether Victor Abe Pfeil was the first luthier to successfully turn their hand to creating an electric violin is impossible to say, but fortunately, examples of his instruments have survived. Currently, these instruments are the earliest of their kind existing in any quantity. An electric violin, electric viola, and other related documents attributed to Pfeil's invention are currently held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and a further 2 electric violins and electric viola are in a private collection. Pfeil was German-born and settled in America, where at some point he met Albert Ted Allen, and together, in Orange County, they produced the Allen Craft Laboratories brand of electric stringed musical instruments. Although none of the instruments reached a marketed production run, they were publicly demonstrated, promoted, and broadcast, receiving excellent press at the time. Like Deardorff before, a great future was prophesied, but similarly, soon after reaching public attention, all news quite suddenly dried up and the instruments effectively disappeared. In 1928, Pfeil applied for the first of 2 patents for a musical instrument invention. At this time, he was registered in the city of Buffalo, just about 80 miles from where Deardorff was living and working. Comparing the first patent against the second, and also with the surviving instruments known, the differences are such it seems likely the first invention was before Pfeil teamed up with Allen. In a 1932 news article exploring the striking relationship between the nature of electricity and music, whilst Pfeil's invention is given space, there is no mention of Allen, or to that matter Deardorff. A few months later, Pfeil's second patent application was made a few weeks before public broadcasts of his electronic violin, viola, and cello. Reference in short news articles at the time mention a trio of bowed electric stringed instruments being developed in the Allen Craft laboratories. Interest was picked up by writer and publisher Hugo Gernsback, who featured Pfeil's instruments in his influential Radiocraft magazine. Announcing, "And now the electric violin," Gernsback wrote about the progress made in developing electronic instruments that could simulate all known instruments, even better than the original. He describes Pfeil's violin as a skeleton violin with advantages over the more common violin. Along with the increased capacity to control tone and volume, it is claimed that this electric violin is capable of producing pure tones nearly over the entire range of the instrument, something the usual violin is incapable of doing, even including the old masters. Gernsback ends the article stating that the instruments would soon be on the market. Pfeil's invention embodied a musical instrument featuring a transforming and amplifying device incorporated into the main design. Following Stroh and Deardorff before him, Pfeil dispensed with the usual body and presented a new instrument similar to an ordinary violin. Not as minimal as Deardorff, but as with Stroh, Pfeil gave the player a physical reference point to the superfluous body and included scroll, neck, fingerboard, bridge and tailpiece, mounted on a suitably turned and finished stick of wood or insulating material. The method of converting string vibration into electrical flux, however, was quite different. Whilst it might be expected to find Pfeil exploiting the piezo effect from carbon granules, as Coma, Deardorff and others, Pfeil found a novel use of the electromagnetic effect. Rather than using magnets and coils to pick up the vibration of strings directly, Pfeil chose a method where the pickup unit was activated by the rocking vibration of the bridge. This allowed the instrument to be strung with gut strings, which was still the standard material used. The 2 patents detail 8 different types of electromagnetic pickup devices, and of these, 3 of the 6 described in the second patent could be used with a standard bridge. Pfeil notes here that one of the arrangements in particular produces exceptionally satisfactory fidelity of tone, and is also one of the forms given where a traditional bridge could be fitted. Considering the instruments that are known to have survived today all have standard bridges, and from studies made of the pickups are considered to be later, further developed musical instruments. In 1934, Allen Craft instruments were presented at Cornell University's School of Electrical Engineering in Ithaca, New York. Private and public presentations of the electric cello were given by the eminent Russian-American professor Vladimir Karapetov. himself an accomplished cellist, and who drew attention to the disadvantages of the small volume of sound from acoustic stringed instruments. Karapetov proposed electrical amplification as the natural solution, and media headlines later in the year referred to the new Karapetov cello, a confusion of fact that appears to have stuck for many decades after news of file vanished from general awareness. The current whereabouts of this particular electric cello is not known. The same year Deardorff's patent was granted, a year after File had made his first application, George Eisenberg submitted for an invention of a musical instrument of the violin type. This has since become something of an elusive curiosity. The invention currently exists as nothing more than an electric violin-related patent. However, from the drawings accompanying the application, Eisenberg's electric violin is instantly recognisable as a typical example of the many skeletal-framed instruments on the market today. Closer inspection of the specification reveals quite a complex electromagnetic pickup device and a description of how it works, begging the question of just how effective the instrument was in practice. Until any more information can be found, Eisenberg's objectives to provide a violin capable of producing great volume with absolute clarity and accuracy of the original tone, and for it to be a simple, compact device, must remain a theoretical ideal without substance. Whilst inventors, luthiers and violinists in America were exploring ways and means for electrifying musical instruments and exploiting new radioelectric technologies, exciting new waves were being created across the ocean. Dr. Oskar Fierling, born in Germany in 1904, and during his lifetime making significant contributions as an electroacoustic engineer and instrument inventor, was granted numerous patents covering a very broad spectrum. Many of them, starting from 1927, relate to musical instruments. By the early 1930s, Fierling was involved in acoustic research and the development of electric instruments at the Heinrich Hertz Institute in Berlin. The first radio concert by the Orchestra of the Future consisted exclusively of electric instruments given at the Institute on October 19, 1932. Audiences marvelled at these new instruments, and there was great public interest. Fierling's work has led to very notable successes, which give reason to hope that the goal of using electrical means to improve the fine structure of the sound rather than imitate a Stradivarius violin will be achieved. Fierling's work is best preserved in his successes creating a new electric piano, which as a key object for the invention converted string vibration into electricity before the sound became audible. Violins naturally followed. Photographs of the all-electric orchestra also include Fierling's Elektrische violin and a cello, and show instruments without the traditional soundboard, a feature of many other bowed electric strings since. The pickup magnets, in which the mechanical vibrations of the strings are converted into electrical ones, are located under the strings, near the bridge, conveyed to an amplifier similar to that of a radio set, and then issued through a loudspeaker. Here again, we find the use of electricity is not just to make the instrument louder, but through manipulation of the signal created by the bowed string, the timbre can be varied, so that notes entirely different from those produced by the player are heard through the loudspeaker. Thus, the violin can be made, for instance, to sound like an oboe. From the scant photographic evidence available, it appears that Fierling used a skeletal, silent practice violin body to which he attached the pickup device, rather than design a specific instrument body. In mid-December of 1929, young Romanian inventor Gabriel Dimitru applied for a patent for an instrument with the elegantly descriptive title Electromagnetic Violin Transmitting Sounds to Loudspeakers. For many decades since, any detail beyond briefest information contained in the patent has proved almost impossible to find, effectively sidelining Dimitru to the same rank of Eisenberg's curiosity factor. However, a donation to the Ștefan Procopiu Science and Technics Museum in 2001 by Dimitru's daughter, Mrs. Ariana Teodorescu, unveiled facts previously unknown to most, significantly unbeknownst to the then newly established and growing electric violin profession. But still, Dimitru's contribution remained in obscurity until the information was digitized and picked up by search engines in 2021, whereupon photographs, articles and advertising material emerged, including the most important object of the donation, the precious electromagnetic violin made after the Paris patent. The collection reveals that Dimitru's violin and a cello based on the same pickup technology were seen and heard in concerts in France and Romania. These instruments were played by Dimitru and by other violinists, Constantin Notara, Karol Kolar and Lucia Burada, cellists Flor Breveman and Gabriel Draghici, in recitals of music by Gluck, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Fauré and Nardini. At one pre-concert talk, Dimitru's invention was described as a great transformation of such a nature as to give a new impetus to instrumental music. The documents donated to the museum also uphold report that Dimitru's best efforts to promote his work were eclipsed by a better-known, successful and much wealthier engineer-inventor. From published interview and other articles, particularly from news appearing in the late 1970s and early 80s, it is compellingly evident that Dimitru's concept and solution to electrifying the violin was copied, possibly stolen, and that Dimitru's place in the timeline of the history of electric stringed musical instruments has been unfairly overshadowed. Dimitru's electric violin exists, only who alive has ever played or even heard it? Dimitru was living and studying at the School of Bridge and Roads in Paris throughout the late 1920s. He had graduated from the School of Public Works Sub-Engineers in Bucharest in 1926, having previously studied violin at the Vasil Lupu Normal School in the city of Iași. What led Dimitru to design and build an electric violin is not known, but a published study of letters sent to the Romanian Patriarch Miron Cristofor reveals Dimitru made a direct appeal for help to defend his invention. From records that came to light only relatively recently, Dimitru found himself faced with forceful, well-established competition, but believing he had the leading legal position, he sought professionals to defend his rights. Reportedly, even before this legal help materialized, his competitor had withdrawn, but it seems the damage had been done, as all news of either new violin vanished by the end of the following year. Half a century later, following presentation of the invention by Dimitru at the International Congress of Science and Technology in Bucharest, news crossed the ocean, arousing dismay, but also finally some recognition. In December 1982, Dimitru received a letter from Dr. Richard Moore, director of the Center for Music Experiment, University of California, stating, "There are many similar tools, but yours is the oldest I know." The letter also gave feedback from Professor Emeritus Max Matthews of Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, noting Dimitru's instrument is really a pioneering work in this domain. For many years, general knowledge and understanding of Dimitru's electromagnetic violin was based entirely on the short text and diagrams accompanying his patent, published in France in July 1930. From this, Dimitru's electric violin is described as consisting of a solid wooden body with an integrated electromagnetic device. String vibration is transmitted directly via a specially designed bridge to a small iron plate, which then moves in front of a permanent magnet surrounded by a coiled length of wire. The flux in magnetic field creates electrical currents in the coil, which, connected in circuit to an amplifier and speaker, broadcast the string vibrations as sound. Dimitru stipulates that the instrument can be at any distance from the audience. The diagrams given in the patent do not show a preferred complete design of an instrument, but it is clear that the sonority of the instrument is entirely superfluous, and that the device can be applied for all the stringed instruments. In an interview Dimitru gave in October 1930 for the Romanian Patria newspaper, insight into the rationale of discarding the traditional resonating body is given as to avoid interference from wood fibres of the body, achieving a perfect and new sound for the ear. His vision was far-reaching and prophetic, posing that his instruments could perform a concert in multiple venues simultaneously and instantly be able to transform a single sound emitted by the musician into a whole series, a single musician replacing an entire orchestra. The unknown interviewer ended the piece commenting that the sound of the electromagnetic cello was clear and loud as a tender call, and predicted that Dimitru's invention would revolutionize many souls and displease perhaps only one class, the professional musician. From the surviving violin and photograph of the cello, we discover the instruments are characterized as being stick-like, skeletal-framed instruments. Both carry a standard scroll, neck, fingerboard and tailpiece. The cello features an outline frame of the instrument with a central truss rod and with a portion of the upper shoulder bout given as the familiar guide for the player. The violin has no outline, consisting just of a central rod running from the neck stop to tail, with a portion of the upper shoulder bout for reference and a small section of the lower bout where a chin rest is affixed. Both instruments bear a strong resemblance to contemporary instruments. Whether actual theft of an idea was involved requires others better versed in copyright and patent law to determine. Simple comparison of the pickup devices revealed Dimitru's pickup is very similar in design and operation to Victor File's earlier patent application. Dimitru's patent, however, was awarded 3 years before File. There are obvious similarities too in the description of the bodies being stick-like and also in the finished instruments incorporating support reference points for the player. Whilst there are clear similarities between these instruments and Deardorff's much earlier invention, Deardorff utilised the piezoelectric effect to transmit string vibration. It is probable all became obscured by more powerful voices on the scene, maybe smothered or silenced by those with established footing in musical instrument manufacture and a harder business acuity to survive. The 1930s saw a great deal of activity electrifying every musical instrument, designed to bring into concerts tone, colouring and other effects never before heard by the human ear. New instruments were manufactured, sold and reached wider public attention than in the previous decade. Their inventors were cussed and discussed for upsetting long-established traditions. Their popularity and success, however, found in immediate and effective integration in live performance, recordings and broadcast. Fewer people today hear the natural acoustic sound of a violin played live and in person than experience it broadcast or enhanced by digital electrical means. There is no known way of broadcasting across the internet, radio, television or cinema without transmitting electrically. It is also very common for venues where music is performed live to use electrically powered music technology systems as an entirely normal part of musical practice. Recording studios abandoned purely acoustic techniques a century ago. With the history of electric guitar and all other plucked electric instruments now meticulously catalogued, spanning over a century, electric violins are most noticeable in their absence, or at best, fleeting appearances. As with the rise, then sudden rapid disappearance of Deardorff's raiolin, the Alan Craft Laboratories and Dimitru's electromagnetic violin, big brand names took to introducing bowed electric stringed instruments in their catalogues. New names quickly appeared, only to disappear as the world collapsed back into war. It was not a good time for small, niche and independent startups, and without exception, only the means of electrification and ideas for body design survived as a commercial enterprise. By the time electric violins would appear again, finding firmer footing as a newly established profession, the originators were largely forgotten and essentially unknown. Think of piano, and for many the names Steinway or Bechstein may leap to mind, depending on what you know about different makes of piano. The word violin, for some, conjures names such as Stradivarius, Amati or Guarnerius, and many more. In terms of electric instruments from the guitar family, Fender or Gibson would be at or very near the top of most lists. Whereas the same question asked about electric violin probably turns up a much more scattered list, and notably many more blanks. Does this mean electric violin has not properly caught on yet? Or simply reflects a lack of wider knowledge of not just the market today, but what came before it? What of the Mackinine violin, seen, heard and read about in 1930, or Lloyd Loire's Vivitone and Beecham's Electro Stringed Instrument Corporation? Lists from the mid-1930s include Fred Ray Quisenberry and the National Violectric, which was sold in enough units to be listed until the early 1940s. There is significant news coverage including recordings and film footage of Benjamin Meissner's instruments as found in Thomas Adrian Cracraft's All-Electric Orchestra. There are also individuals of great interest and note, including the French violinist Paul Bizot and his Electro-Human Orchestra from 1931, and then the widely reported and most positively heralded earthquake-inspired electric violins and cellos by Dr. Hugo Benioff. These, and other instruments yet to be found, are mostly unheard by living generations. They cannot be consigned to scrap on a presumptive conclusion that the oldest electric violins must therefore have totally failed. The fact that the profession is now firmly established with inextricable links to these founding pioneers presents an alternative view. The violin family was fully electrified by 1930. Proof of concept is in the production model prototypes so successfully executed and enthusiastically received. Despite their novelties and newness, the possibilities these earliest electric violin makers and players presented electrified the minds of every generation following. Genealogically, lines of progression are easier to identify and comprehend, and today's market is better appreciated. As more databases of digitised material are added to general public domain, and as institutions around the world continue to forge links to great stores of text, images, audio and film, then the evolution of the violin from a purely acoustic instrument to one that encompasses electric and digital realms too will not only be further understood, but fully exploited over time. Strangely, it is less commonly appreciated by players that turning the vibrations of the violin into electric current changes the character of their instrument. This is unavoidable and an irreversible part of the process, but absolutely fine. As a profession today, we owe our existence to the wonders of la fée électricité and offer eternal thanks to those luminaries of the past who pursued harnessing its powers.